Mark, brilliant to see you. Looking extremely well. I'm sure life not traveling suits you very well. Let's just talk a little bit about that. The frenetic nature of Formula One these days and the travel involved and the commitment of everybody who is working with the teams.
Yeah. It's pretty tough. Just because you on the home front, you don't have time you can't plan really very well for the things that you want to do at home. And obviously most people don't plan their lives around you. So you miss an awful lot of stuff that other people have going on. So staying in touch with friends at home and family, it does become quite tricky. You're pretty much confined to the winter for that sort of thing. And then in terms of the work side of things, it also makes it difficult in that being at the track is obviously great. You have first-hand experience of what's going on, but the times you're traveling have a big impact on your time of availability. And also with the schedule these days of 20 plus races, you're not even in the factory or in the facilities for that long. So communication with the people that you should be working with who are factory based becomes quite difficult as well, just scheduling time to speak to them. So that is quite a tricky aspect of the whole thing. And there's a real danger, I think, and I'm sure a lot of the teams feel it, is that you become part of a bubble, a separated bubble, and the relationships with the people also involved but more factory-based can become quite difficult to maintain properly. Obviously, things like Zoom and what have you help in that respect, and other communication devices are available. But it's not the same as being on a one-to-one basis, on a discussion one-to-one. So I think it makes things very difficult, and just lack of time. There are obviously the teams have many more people in them than they did when I started. So they are covering a lot more detail, but that means that other people have to cover a lot more detail rather than you being necessarily involved in all that detail. And so that, again, you're relying on other people more than I think was the case when I started. So it's quite tricky.
Mark, nothing to beat, therefore, than the proverbial water cooler discussion on a Tuesday after a Grand Prix.
Exactly.
And I suspect over the years, a lot of great ideas, steps forward have been made in just such an environment.
I would imagine so, yeah. And certainly that was something I enjoyed, was, coming back from a race on a Monday morning and just wandering over to different groups in the drawing office and just having a chat about how things went over the weekend. But with so many more races on the calendar now, that becomes very difficult. Although I have to say, I did start at a time when we also used to do racing and testing, and that testing did take up a great deal of time as well. So maybe I'm over-egging that to some extent, but that was, by doing that testing, you were involved in slightly different aspects of what you were doing. So you had to communicate with people about the stuff you were testing as well as just race weekends. So it was a different aspect. And it gave you more of an in-depth knowledge having that testing, I would say, than now.
Well, here we are on the cusp of the Singapore Grand Prix. What thoughts do you have when you think of the Singapore Grand Prix as an engineer and your experience of going to that race over the years? What are your key points?
I mean, when we first started, it was obviously there's the heat, which affects everybody. The track is quite a long track. It was incredibly bumpy the first time we went there. So bumpy, in fact, that it was the first track that at McLaren we had a LiDAR for the simulator, and we ran it for the first time, and it was so bumpy we actually thought it must be wrong. So we actually turned down the bumps for that first session in the simulator just to make it drivable, and then when we got to the track we found it actually was as bad as the map had said. It's a circuit which is very unforgiving, obviously, with the walls. The curbs are a big problem for the ride of the car. It was always a good one, Kevin was always brilliant round there. Recent working with Haas. Last year we had a bit of an issue with an aerodynamic development that he didn't have on his car that Nico had, which blunted his performance somewhat. But it's always been it's a difficult track. There's lots of different types of corners. The tyres get hot and lose grip through the lap. So by the end of the lap, they're really screaming. The last two corners onto the start-finish straight are very different than the rest of the track. So they always present a big problem in terms of balance. And just stringing a clean lap together for the drivers has always been tricky. It's a fabulous track. I really enjoyed those races, and I always enjoyed being in the Far East as well. And it's a good event. Being the first night race that we ever did made it special back then, and it's still different. I just think it was one of the most enjoyable events. It's just always a pleasure to get back to your cold hotel room after you've been outside for 17, 18 hours, that's all.
In theory, because of the local time schedule, you keep the same body clock. Did that always work for you? Was there a difficulty in adjusting to that?
It was a bit of a strange one to start with. I wouldn't say for the teams it presented a huge problem. I think the first year we went, our scheduling was a bit awry because we started off working to normal time schedule, so normal Singapore daytime schedule for the sort of setup, and then we drifted to the actual event timing on the sort of Thursday, Friday, and that was a big problem. And then I think all the teams eventually corrected to going in late in the afternoon on the first day and working till early in the morning, so you're just sticking to a more European time. And of course it had the added benefit of when you came home again, you actually didn't have to convert back to European time, as long as it wasn't a back-to-back race. So I don't think for the mechanics and the engineers, etc., I don't think it was a huge issue. It just seemed a bit strange. I think the drivers maybe felt it a bit more. I think some of them certainly complained, or didn't complain, but just said it was difficult to manage. And I think sometimes they had sponsor functions and media events that were more normal daytime based, and they found it difficult to incorporate them into their schedule. But overall, it was surprisingly straightforward, I think, at the first time we did it. And it always was you always seem to have more time on your hands. That was the other thing we couldn't understand, is you actually felt like you had more time. It was really odd, even though you have the same schedule, but somehow you felt like you had more time. It was odd.
Weird. Mark, you touched on the question of tyre temperatures and the heat involved in Singapore and managing the tyres. A lot of discussion at the moment about the improvements Red Bull appear to have made, and on the assumption that their new floor is working for a more efficient aerodynamic package for them, which would kind of seem to be the case at Monza and in Baku. Can you give us some idea of what problems they may be looking at in terms of tyre management for Singapore? Is tyre management something to be taken separately from the improvement in the floor, or will that have an impact on the way they can use the tyres?
It will definitely have some sort of impact, because the sort of the shape of the aero performance in terms of ride height management will affect how the car uses its tyres, how it avoids overslipping them over bumps. So if they've improved their tyre management through a floor development, it's quite likely that it's not just a question of adding downforce. It may well be that they've got a profile that is a better shape, so the driver has more downforce more of the time than he had before, and so maybe they don't have to run the car quite so stiff to keep it in a very narrow working range, and that, if that is the case, then the reduction in stiffness basically helps keep the tyres in contact with the ground more of the time, which is easier for the tyres. They'll slip less because they're seeing less load variation, and that will reduce temperatures. So if it's something like that, then it will have a big effect on their tyre management. And Singapore being such, it's still a relatively bumpy circuit. It got a lot smoother as they resurfaced it over the years, but and I think the curbs became less aggressive as well. But it's still something it's at the forefront, and being such a long lap with the fast corners at the end of the lap, keeping those tyres alive for the full lap in qualifying and obviously for the duration of the race is really important. It's tough on the rear tyres in Singapore.
Just talking about ride height, in 2025, what is the defining element of the ride height you can run with? Presumably you just want to run as low as possible at any given moment, but is it bumps? Is it curbs? Is it bouncing still? Is it tyre management? What is it? What is the final point that you look at?
It's going to most likely come down to skid wear in the end. On most tracks, the tracks are smooth enough that the limitation will tend to be the how low you can run the car, end of straight, or possibly there might be some curbs somewhere which also contribute to skid wear. But on most circuits, it's that. If there is severe bottoming on a very bumpy circuit, you might reach the limitation of what the car can take in terms of impact. So, for instance, it wouldn't be a huge surprise if the engine was vulnerable to impact, because obviously the floor is attached through the engine at the back of the car, and I know on some engines, if the impacts got too severe, they would ask us to do something to mitigate that. So that might be a limitation. Bouncing, it was a limitation in the early days of this generation of car, but I think most teams have developed their cars and kind of mitigated those problems, so that became less of an issue. But the bottom line is there's almost always more downforce to be had by running the car as low as you can get it. The difficulty is in balancing. You can't run the car infinitely stiff because the cars won't stay on the road, which is obviously what you'd do to get the car as low as possible. So it's that compromise between how stiff can you get away with and getting the car as low as you can. And then if you have a car with a wider range of rear ride height downforce performance, it puts you in a better position, because you could probably run the car a little bit softer and be easier on the tyres. If you have a car with a very peaky floor, then you really do have to stay in that window, and it might just be that you have to run the car stiff and you can't avoid it, and then you're looking at tyre degradation problems. So yeah, that's the sort of thing that the engineers on the teams will be trying to come up with the best compromise with, and using their simulators and simulation tools, as well as their knowledge from previous events, to try and come up with the best starting solution for that, and then obviously evolving that as the week progresses.
Speaking of impact, it was surprising and unusual to see Alonso's rear suspension fail after hitting the curb coming out of Ascari in the Italian Grand Prix. Yeah,
it was very odd, wasn't it? I mean, I gather that the team said that they thought that he'd run through some gravel earlier in the weekend, and I mean, that's like someone firing a shotgun at the wishbones, effectively, and that it was that damage which instigated the failure, because it sounded like he didn't experience any loads that were abnormal as such, even though he ran wide on one occasion. But I mean, it's not normally something you would expect to happen, that's for sure. Slightly concerning.
Say that again. Interesting that they pointed to that gravel. That was going to be my next question, actually. It's the diagnostic process you now have in the garage, whether it be a fuel leak, hydraulics, electrics, whatever it is. In the old days, there was a lot of sort of torches under the car, having a look here, there. I guess it's very different now, right? I guess it is. You just press button A, press button B, and it's all solved.
Well, I think you'd be surprised. There is more monitoring done, but in something like that, there's no way they could have known that damage had occurred without the car coming back to the pit and looking at it physically. And so that's why it's such an unusual problem, really. If there'd been some damage to an element which changed the loads, if there'd been a big strike to the suspension, they'd just seen that in the data, and they could have they would have limits, and they'd known that a limit had been exceeded.
Now,
and
I get that, but the point I'm making is now, if you have an electrical problem, you can pinpoint that pretty quickly, right? It won't be something, let's say that, for example, or a misfire, whatever.
The knowledge that the teams have is pretty detailed in that respect. It's just when you get physical disturbances from outside, that's not always so easy. So, I mean, all the cars, for example, there's lots of pressure taps on the floors these days. So the floors are just peppered with pressure tapping, so you've got live monitoring of the aero performance of the cars. And that's something that we didn't have years ago, and it's come on a lot. But it's still a bit of a dodgy one, because you can get damage to a car, and if it's not in a particular area where you've got lots of sensors, then you won't necessarily know what the effect of that damage is. You'll just know the car has damage, and that's why you get these comments from the team. The driver will say, "Oh, I've something's wrong. I've damaged the car." The team will look at the dash and say, "Well, we don't see anything." They're right. They don't see anything in their data, but the driver is also right that there is some damage to the car, and it's incredibly frustrating for the driver to hear that there's nothing wrong when he can feel that there's definitely something is. But that's just a limitation of you can't measure everything all the time, but certainly they have a lot more information than they used to.
Where are we at now in the sort of cooling aids you can give the drivers at a circuit like Singapore? Do you still try, as an engineer, do you still say the less on the car, the better, or does everything work perfectly now? The cooling suits, the drinks?
For the driver cooling?
Yeah.
I mean, they all tend to use sort of the cool jackets before they get in the car. A couple of years ago, they did give dispensation for us to put some dry ice in the cockpit before the driver got in, which otherwise is illegal, because they used to worry about us trying to cool the fuel through putting dry ice in the cockpit. The cars have a certain amount of airflow through them, but honestly, it's pretty difficult. And I think it comes down to the fitness training and the sort of dietary regimes and hydration that the physios go through with the drivers. And I think it's not really often that you see a driver in big trouble with that sort of thing anymore. I mean, these guys, I think the amount of fitness, the level of fitness these guys operate at is a whole nother game now. They are super, super fit guys, certainly even compared to when I started. It's been transformation, driver fitness. It's amazing, really.
But is the drink bottle bulletproof now? And is it cold water throughout the race?
It's not cold throughout the race. No. The drink will get quite hot and be pretty unpleasant. But as I understood it, warm water or warm drink is actually easier absorbed by the body anyway. So it's when it reaches 50 or 60 degrees that I think it became pretty unpleasant. But unfortunately, no, there's no. The teams aren't going to go to the effort of cooling the drink. That would be extra weight that they would consider not necessary. In terms of the reliability of the systems, they're generally pretty good. A lot of them are just done by, we don't even have pumps these days, just the action of the car braking, accelerating. If the driver sucks at the right time, he actually will get a drink. So actually taking pumps out of the equation made the systems more reliability. They tend not to use any sort of, we tend just to use water, I think, mainly, because if you put flavorings, glucose, that sort of thing in the systems, it can clog them up. So I think a lot of the drivers don't use anything particularly sticky for their drinks. It's bad news. So no, and some drivers still don't bother. I think, isn't Max famously not said he doesn't bother taking a drink or something?
That's because he says a full bottle of water, full casket of water.
That's right, you mentioned.
Upsets the weight distribution of the car. Please advise, Mark.
Yes, it will have an absolutely minuscule effect. I mean, and I know Formula One's all about the detail, but that effect would be so small as not something you would consider, frankly. It's just too small an effect. I mean, they're limited to I think it certainly was 1.5 litres of water, because we were getting to the point a few years ago when we were trying to run sort of 5-6 litre driver drinks bottles on the cars that we could refill for run empty in qualifying and fill for the race. And
oh, surely not
about that. So it's only 1.5 litres, so maximum. Yeah, I wouldn't worry about the weight distribution effect of a driver drinks bottle being emptied. Where you put the bottle, I would say, is important. You don't want it at the back, or if you've got a target weight distribution, there will be thought put into where that is. That is true. But yeah.
Mark, so many questions I could ask you, but I know there'll be a lot of questions going on from here from viewers around the world to you and your vast knowledge. Thank you so much for spending this time. One final question, though, as we go into Singapore. Can you just talk a little bit about the world of tyre blisters today, where it was perhaps 5 years ago, where we are today, and how worrying is a blister on a tyre if we do see one in the race on Sunday?
Yeah, certainly Pirelli did do a lot of work to reduce blistering problems. We had some quite severe blistering problems a few years ago, particularly on the rear tyres. So the location of the blister is paramount. Blistering on the rear tyres, particularly in the anywhere inside or outside, middle of the tread, that was always a serious problem. We've seen some blistering recently on the inside shoulders of front tyres. That is somewhat less of a concern in terms of performance, because the inner edge of the front tyre isn't necessarily doing a huge amount of work a lot of the time. You'll very rarely see blistering on the outside edge of a tyre, because the outside edge of front tyre doesn't really do that much work at most tracks these days. The blistering is typically, it comes from where the tread joins the sidewall of the tyre. You end up with a seam between the two parts. And so the material is a bit thicker there, and it's sort of being worked, and it's moving around, and it's the hysteresis of that joint which generates internal temperature, and that obviously becomes very hot and basically boils the rubber. It's not really rubber, but the rubber out from the inside out, and then you get the eruptions of the blisters coming through on the outside. And certainly Pirelli did a lot of work on the way where those seams were on the tyre, and the construction of those seams to try to minimise that effect. And I have to say they did a good job, because it did reduce dramatically. But it's always a bit of a seam. If it is occurring, I think there was some at Monza, probably from the inside front being dragged around high-speed corner like the Parabolica. As I said, it's not really a performance issue, but the risk is obviously you've got less rubber left on that part of the tread, and if the tyre were to run over something sharp, there is an increased risk of a puncture. Is probably the biggest danger of that on a front tyre.
Can you see a blister on the telemetry you're getting from the car, or is it something you visually have to monitor on a TV screen?
No, you would only, obviously the driver can probably see at the front, just visually. He may be able to see the rear through the mirrors, maybe not. If you've got infrared cameras looking at the tyres, potentially you could see where they're running very hot, and I guess you could have a critical temperature that that could present a problem. A lot of the time, to be honest, you see it from the television footage. Obviously, all the cars have onboard footage most of them facing forward, so you'd see on the front. The rear, a bit more tricky, but there's nothing in terms of load that will tell you, other than if you developed a vibration. That's possible, but then you may not know why that is. But I think the reality is that you'd have found that problem during the practice sessions, and so you'd be aware of it and know its likelihood. So if you had something in the race that didn't look quite right, you'd probably be looking for symptoms that you'd seen earlier in the weekend. The teams have sensors looking at mounted on the front wing, normally mounted on the front wings, and others mounted either in the side pods or the floor, looking at the tyre surfaces. you've got the sensors looking at the tyre surface, looking at temperature, and you've got the pressure sensors in the wheels, which also have a temperature element built into them as well. But that's obviously that's just measuring the sort of the air temperature. You can put sensors on the wheel rims that are looking at the inside of the tyre carcass itself. So there are a range of ways of doing it. But I think now I suspect every single car will have a sensor mounted on both front wing end plates or both front wings. Often they use the adjusters. There are little lumps on the adjusters, and they sometimes contain sensors. And as I said, either mounted on the floor in recesses or in the side pods looking at the rear tyres. It's good information. It's very It's being sent back all the time live. So most teams have tyre engineers now, and they're looking at that information almost continuously. You can review it post session if you're the race engineers, but you'll have a feed. I mean, I used to have a feed on my display showing me temperature from different sources. The only difficulty is making sure everyone's talking about the same temperatures, that's all. Because when you have an array of temperatures across a tyre, you'll get one person thinking you're talking about the inside of the tyre and another person's talking about the outside of the tyre. So you've got to get your naming convention agreed across everybody. But yeah, it's good stuff. It's really important information. Because tyre temperature is absolutely critical these days. If the tyres aren't working in their correct window, then you lose a lot of grip. I would be speaking slightly out of turn here, but I would say that when we moved to the Pirelli tyres, they did seem to be more sensitive to variations in temperature than the tyres we'd used previously. And that was one of the big problems that drivers had getting used to driving the tyres. And I still feel now that one of the factors in the car's performance variation is tyre temperature management to a greater degree than maybe used to be the case. And the fact is the drivers can't push the tyres all the time without overheating them. And then once the tyres have gone too hot, it's like a memory. They lose grip for a long time, don't necessarily recover it. So that's why you see the cars, they don't slide very much these days, and why if you have a driver spins a wheel or has a lockup, the effects can be quite significant in terms of grip, and can affect the car for a number of corners, even laps afterwards. So, and it's why following another car is so difficult, because you lose downforce, a lot of downforce, and that just means that your grip is reduced. The car is now sliding around more. The tyres are getting hotter, and your grip from the tyres is reducing. So you just get into this sort of spiral of negative impact on the car behind's performance, and not only is it you've lost grip now, but you're also damaging the tyres for the coming laps ahead. They don't recover. So it is absolutely crucial. I mean, I remember a race we did with Kev in Japan, I can't remember what year it was, 22 or 23. I think he got taken off by someone at the start of the race. He ended up about 30 seconds behind the field, having had to make a pit stop. He was going a second lap quicker than his teammate because he was in clear air. And we were like, oh, look, the car's performing really well, whereas the other car didn't do so well. But the reality was that if he'd been in traffic, the pace would have been the same as the other car, and we wouldn't have looked that great. So it's a very difficult problem, and it's why the drivers are so, when you see cars in a train, they're so desperate to get ahead of that car ahead because it does so much damage to their performance. I mean, most circuits now, you need more than 1 second a lap advantage to overtake, to have a good chance of overtaking the car ahead. But you will lose 1 second in performance by being behind another car. So it's always a bit frustrating when you've got a quick car and you can't get past.
But we have DRS, and these cars were designed to make it much easier to overtake.
Yeah. DRS, the funny thing with DRS is you can have that quick car and you are just about to get ahead because DRS adds half a second, 6/10, or improves your lap time by that much, and you're just able to get ahead, maybe. But the car behind then has that advantage, and your tyres are still in a poor state because you've been following him for 10 laps. There's quite a high risk he's going to get back in front of you with his slower car. It's really frustrating. And the other thing was you'd get ahead of a car. You can drag a slower car along because he gets that benefit. So you can't shake this bloody guy off, So DRS is it's a funny thing. It can make it creates other problems. And as for the cars, I think it's true that originally they were somewhat better for overtaking, but obviously the teams have developed them, and that development inevitably means that the wash from the car ahead it becomes more complicated, becomes more difficult for the car behind to deal with. So I think we've seen a deterioration in that as the years have gone on. So I think we're pretty much back to where we were before, I would say. But honestly, if the tyres were less temperature sensitive, then I think that you would find that overtaking would be better. So I don't think I think people talk about the effect of the car in front being a purely aero effect, but the reason it's bad is because of the aero effect on the tyre performance. Because at the end of the day, it's the tyres that are connecting the car to the ground. So it's two things. So if you could improve the tyres' temperature resistance or instantaneous performance relative to temperature, I think you'd see an improvement as well. I know it's something that teams did ask Pirelli to look into, but I'm not going to say it's easy. That's for sure.
I'd imagine that's unbelievably complicated within the spectrum of everything else they have to manage as well. The logistics, safety and everything else. Start thinking about that. At the same time, you've got presumably F1 stroke Liberty saying we want the tyres to fall off the cliff, we want lots of pit stops, we want racing to be dramatic. How do you balance that against more stable tyre temperature?
Well, I think ideally you'd have a tyre that was temperature insensitive but just wore out, so that as the tyre reached the point where it was worn out, you lost grip. So that would force you to do more pit stops. But for the actual racing, it would be better if the tyre was less temperature sensitive, so that when you're behind another car, you didn't lose a load of performance, which is what makes it very difficult for a faster car to get past a slower car. And obviously, circuits with longer DRS zones, it's much easier. But the problem for a lot of the circuits, you can't have a long enough DRS zone. Or you get a DRS train. That's the other one, where there's just a whole bunch of cars all in DRS. So the one at the back end can pass the one in front because that car also has DRS. So I think DRS was a step forward, honestly, personally. But it's not a magic solution. There's still lots of issues. And I say there are quite a lot of circuits where the DRS zones, they're actually not long enough because they can't fit in long enough zones.
Here's a nice calm thought with which to end with, Mark. 5 minutes to go, Q1, Singapore. There's just been a red flag. Everybody's got to go out. You've got to get the tyre temperatures perfect for that one lap. You've got to monitor the distances. Make sure your driver's not going to complain about traffic. Please advise again.
that is where the stress came in. Honestly, it was absolutely everything. I mean, Singapore is probably a place where you'd be wanting to sit in the pit lane for as long as possible to get those tyre temperatures and pressures down as much as you can before going out. It's one of the where you might see a driver towards the head of the queue letting someone in front of them, because actually he's doing that so that he can spend more time in his pit lane letting his tyres cool down. On the other hand, Singapore, you want to be first out, don't you? Because as soon as there's an accident on the track, your times, you're not going to get a lap time. So it's all those things that make it so exciting. I mean, it's just the drama of qualifying. I'm not sure how well it comes across on television, to be honest, but it is absolutely the most difficult thing to manage in the race weekend. It is the most challenging, exciting, I would say, part of the whole weekend. just the time pressures and all the different factors. It's intense. It is unbelievably intense. I wish it could come across. If there was a way of getting what the teams are going through at every fraction of a second over to the viewers, I think they would find it unbelievable. It's fantastic.
We just need to mic up engineers like you up in the pit lane. That would do the job, I think. And a few GoPro cameras in the garage picking up all the audio.
Well, if you could do like a program where you actually just spent the whole program just doing that would be amazing. Yeah, including all the discussion that goes on. That honestly, I don't think people can understand just how complex and terrifying in many ways.
Well, we've been saying that ad nauseum on the show, that is the real story of Formula One. The drivers are the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much more that we could talk about behind the scenes. And you've given us a wonderful little insight of that already, and hopefully there'll be a lot more. Thanks so much for your time, mate. Really good to see you. And as I say, we'll have you back very, very soon.
Okay. No, that's absolutely fantastic. Thanks for the opportunity, Peter.
So there we are. I know the mic wasn't working initially. Sorry about that. My explanation is that I was so excited about having Mark Slade on the show. And so was my computer, that my computer crashed. Everything crashed about a minute before I was going to go live. And so that's my excuse. No, that's right. And then I rebooted everything. The one thing I forgot to reboot, of course, was the mic, the sound. So there you go. That's why. Anyway, that was the Mark Slade interview, which I really enjoyed doing. I'm very kind of Mark to spend time with us doing that. And the point was all I said in that intro was that this was something we recorded yesterday. We're going to have Mark on live, and you can see him there on my mobile phone below me afterwards for your questions and answers. And then I was rambling on about how we're using the mobile phone because I'm a Mac guy, and it's easier with a Mac not to have too many plugins, in my experience anyway. But that's another story. Mark, can you hear me okay? Are you there?
Good. Absolutely.
Good. Now, I must also explain, before everybody starts moaning about the audio, that I had this all set up so that the speaker of the mobile phone was adjacent to the mic. And just before, again, we went to this section, suddenly I couldn't get the picture to orientate correctly so that I could have the phone next to the mic. So I've told Mark to speak loudly and clearly, as he no doubt is used to doing in Formula One anyway, And hopefully everybody can hear Mark, much more importantly, forget me. And let me start, Mark, by saying we just had this missive in from the FIA. You were talking about the heat and the importance of taking that into account when we get to Singapore. In accordance with Article 2619 of the sporting regs, and having received a forecast that predicts the heat index will be greater than 31 at some time during the race, a heat hazard is declared. First thing is that garage doors are allowed to be closed, presumably to keep the aircon in the garage. Any other implications you think that would come from that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, a few years ago, they said that when it was very hot, we could put some dry ice in the cockpit before the driver got in to try and help with that a little bit. And in the past, they've been very upset about people putting dry ice anywhere near the cockpit or underneath the car before the car goes out, because they perceived that we were trying to reduce the fuel temperature, which obviously we weren't trying to do at all.
Yeah, right.
No. So they may be allowing that again. There was talk about having, I think it was extra cooling designed and available, ready to go for these sorts of circumstances. I have a feeling, certainly in my time, so obviously I'm a little bit out of touch, I don't know what the latest TDs say, but that hadn't progressed as far as I know. So maybe they've reintroduced that, and there's some extra cooling that teams could put on, and obviously the implication is the weight of the car goes up. So the minimum weight had to go up to allow that to happen on a sort of one-off basis. But I don't think there's much more they can do, really. It's the drivers are fit; they'll be fine.
The drivers, I mean, from my experience at Singapore, the guys I really feel sorry for are the mechanics, actually, because as much as you can AC the garage and you can have the doors closed, the doors are open when the cars are going in and out. The cars have got a massive amount of heat in the garage there, and you would have experienced that. It's a complete nightmare, right?
Yeah, and you've got this stack of like 30 tyres in the back of the garage all on heat. So that's actually pumping heat into the garage as well. And the airflow through the garage is not great. So it's pretty uncomfortable as an environment. And the guys will be wearing their sort of race suits for the race on Sunday. So that's not great either. But everyone manages. Yeah, we've done it for how many years now? I think the first race was, 2008, was it?
Was it Alonso Gate or Briatore Gate? I can't remember, one of the two.
That was the year after, wasn't it?
Oh, was it? Okay.
Clean, it was 2009, was it? Well, maybe it was 2000. No, it was 2008, wasn't it? Yeah. I think you're right.
Yeah,
actually.
what a way to start. You just mentioned tyre warmers. Just on that point, we've got less energy going through the tyre warmers now as part of the, I don't know what it is. I guess it's part of the cost-cutting regulations or something. Have you?
They reduce temperatures that we heat the tyres to, and obviously that had an influence on Pirelli's design of the compounds. As I understood, the main issue there was they wanted to be greener and use less power. I think the motivation behind there was talk of banning tyre blankets a few years ago, and that was a cost thing. Personally, I didn't really agree with that because the cost is relatively small compared to the budgets of the teams. And I don't know. I think having the cars on the grid with blankets plugged in, it all looks pretty dramatic, doesn't it? And high tech, and I think it adds to the appeal.
I think also the revealing of the tyre covers and everybody seeing what compound everybody's on. I mean, you presumably don't know what your oppo's on, right? Your opposition's on.
You actually get information from Pirelli a little bit before the blankets come off these days, but it's not a long time before. It's like a few minutes before you get to see that. The other thing that isn't unimportant is that it means that the tyres are at operating temperature when the driver leaves the pit and goes out onto the track. Whereas if he goes out onto the track on cold tyres, it's obviously much more risky. And some people might say that might add to the spectacle, and they manage it in other series. But I don't know. I think it's a bit of a safety thing. I think it's better that the tyres are ready to go and it just makes everything happen more promptly.
But my sub-question to you is going to be, with that reduction in heat of the warmers, has that had any impact on the way you run out laps, heat laps, manage the tyres? What impact has it had?
Well, I think Pirelli probably redesigned the compounds to work in different temperature ranges, but it does mean that certainly initially there were more tracks where it was more difficult to get the tyres up to temperature. So when it was cool and on a low energy circuit, the drivers had to push very hard on the outlaps to get the tyres up to temperature. Because even though we were heating to 70 degrees, if the tyres actually wanted to be at 90 degrees, then obviously that is a bit of a problem. But then I think the tyres have effectively got softer and lower working range at the different tracks since then. So nowadays you'll see the drivers actually trying to go very slowly around the outlaps because it's more likely they'll put too much energy into the tyres before the start of the lap, particularly the rears. So what is sometimes difficult is that the fronts get worked less hard typically on a lap. So it's more difficult to get fronts up to temperature than the rears.
Right.
And that's something that the drivers have to manage during the laps. And then, of course, they introduce these minimum times for qualifying out laps and cool down laps. So again, that reduced the opportunity to go slowly, which was the intention. So now you see the drivers in qualifying, if they're trying to do 2 laps in one set, they'll actually come through the pit lane or even stop in the box for up to, say, a minute and a half, and that's to cool the tyres down and drop the pressures down before they go back out and have another go. That's all the consequence of these sorts of things.
And I'm sure we see quite a lot of that going on at Singapore this weekend in practice.
It is a track where the tyres will be very hot, so keeping the tyres down to temperature is going to be the main challenge for this weekend, particularly the rears.
Right, now let's have a look at some of the questions from our viewers, Mark. I've got to explain that there's usually a sort of backlog of people that get their question lined up long before we've gone live. And obviously they're at the top of the list. And then questions that will be arising as a result of people having watched your interview and now what we're chatting about are going to be at the bottom of the list. It's always a bit of a struggle to get through them all and to go up and down the list. That's another thing that is just a function of this live stream. The next thing is you'll notice that I've moved the camera now successfully to the other side, so we've got the good audio. But what this means now is that when I go to the first question, which I think I can bring up now, it's going to be on the wrong side, so I'm going to have to redo that positioning, which I think I can do quite quickly and easily. 1 second. Not bad.
You're doing this, not me. That's all I can say.
Yeah, well, that's, it's just about there, I think. Okay, I think we've got it. Cool. So Sarosh Soman is one of our regulars. And this is before he's seen the interview, obviously. A few questions from last week. We didn't even get answered last week. I noticed that Michael Schumacher leans a lot while manipulating the car into a corner. Others weren't doing it that much. It was almost as if his seatbelts were loose to give him that sort of angle. It's an interesting point, isn't it? Often you see drivers that lean their helmet more into a corner or not, and sometimes they even lean the other way. Peter Revson was a good example of that. But when you were working with Michael, or in general, did that strike you with Michael as something that he did more than most drivers?
I can't say it was, to be honest. I'm not sure. No, it didn't strike me. But then maybe I just wasn't looking for it. I'd say one thing that is a factor now is obviously with the head restraints, or the impact structures they have inside the cockpit now. The teams found that restricting the driver's head movement was good for aero. So we started adding sort of pads onto the headrests, the sort of U-shaped headrest that goes around the top of the cockpit, and that restricted the driver's helmet's motion. So to some extent, I think there's just been a general reduction in driver helmet movement because there isn't actually so much space anymore. But I can't say I noticed that. I remember standing with. Oh no, that was to do with steering. Sorry, I was going to go on to something completely irrelevant there.
Well, let me ask you this: there are a few aerodynamic tweaks on the helmets now, quite a few, and it looks like the helmets are quite integral to the shape of the aero package.
Yeah.
What you were around at the point where all that evolution was taking place on those little tweaks on the helmets, I guess.
Yeah.
Working with Arai, Bell, whatever. Schubert.
Yeah. There's two aspects to that, really. The original thing was, this might sound silly, but keeping the helmet on the driver's head could actually be a bit of a challenge in keeping it square. And that's why some of the sort of chin spoilers were introduced to. The airflow actually kept the helmet straight on the driver's head. And then the aero guys got involved because airflow into the airbox became a priority. And we had a bit of a scheme, I think it was at Renault, developing the helmet, the top of the helmet shaping to try to improve the feed into the airbox. But there was the basic package that was supplied by the helmet manufacturers, and then there was our own one. And unfortunately, we found that the helmet manufacturer's own one was just as good as the one we derived, and they were very unhappy that the drivers were moving their heads around, and they couldn't perfect a shape other than in one particular position. So in the end, I think that died a bit of a death. But a lot of them just used the standard helmet supplied parts, but that's what they're doing. They're just improving airflow behind the driver's head and also at the front, just to keep the driver's helmet on. I remember Heikki, when he joined McLaren, he had a big problem. We did the first test with him, I think it was in Jerez, and his helmet was actually pretty much coming off his head down the straights, because obviously the airflow in the McLaren cockpit was different to what he'd experienced in the Renault before that. And we had to do quite a lot of work with him and his helmet supplier to improve the padding inside the helmet and the spoilers to keep his head on, to keep his helmet on. Yeah, he said he could barely see down the straight because the window of the visor was actually disappearing up to his forehead. So it's a bit dramatic.
I imagine the hardest driver to fit before we had the templates for the cockpit would have been Alexander Wirtz. from your experience?
He was difficult to get in the car, yeah, being such a tall lad. I think when he drove the car it was Imola, wasn't it? He drove the McLaren in 2005. He actually raced it. He was really struggling there. He definitely had a bit of an impact on his performance. I think he finished third, didn't he? So he did well, but the cockpit it wasn't big enough for him. With Nico, when Nico came to Renault, the chassis changed over his time to make them more suitable for him. The first one he got into, he was really struggling with his knees. He's got quite, and he won't mind me saying this, he's got quite a wide backside. It's not.
This is Nico Hülkenberg you're talking about, right?
Yeah, Nico Hülkenberg. Yeah, he's got very wide hips, and so he ended up sitting very high in the car, and too high. He didn't like where he was sitting, but we had no choice. So we eventually, over the next 2 years, they widened the chassis further forwards where his seat was, so he could sit further forward with his hips. And also we had to move the back of the chassis behind his head rearwards, and so the headrest could go further backwards so he could then tilt his head back. Because I think in 2017, when he first drove the car, he was basically driving with his head tilted forward, which was really difficult for him. Yeah, it was not good at all. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you, Sarosh, for that question. Very good. Lots of feedback. Oh, another one from Sarosh. Anyway, this says, "Hi, Mark. Nice to have got a chance to interact with you. Question to both of you. What would be a typical heart rate of Formula One drivers, given that they are always on the limit? Also, isn't that a typical short corner driver?" I'm not sure Mark wants to talk about short corner drivers. He might be into the whole thing. I don't know. Would have lower heart rate than a reflexy driver. For example, Max, Michael, Leclerc always look reasonably fresh out of the car after a race. Is it the adrenaline levels are lesser? Are you familiar with when we talk about short corners on this channel, what we're talking about there, Mark, or not?
Not really.
No, you're an engineer, aren't you? You're looking at data all the time. Anyway, I basically distinguish between guys like Max, Charles these days, Michael, certainly, Alan Prost, Jim Clark, Sterling Moss, and many more are drivers that are so good at manipulating the car that they can actually kind of extend the straight a bit by turning in a little bit earlier, and they're turning the car slightly, but then they're trading off lateral load against brakes into a rotation point, which isn't necessarily the apex. It might be before the apex, the normal geometric apex, and then they get the car beautifully straight mid-corner, don't worry too much about minimum speed, and then they got a nice straight exit. And, it does seem to be a thing, and some drivers do that. Ayrton Senna didn't do that, but Nigel Mansell did, for example. But anyway, the point is from Sarosh, he's saying, do you have any feel and numbers for pulse rates? Have you ever been around when they've monitored any of your drivers that you've been working with?
I haven't been exposed to an awful lot of that information. I seem to remember, I can't remember who it might have been, possibly Heikki, possibly Kimi. I suspect that it's quite variable from one driver to another. I seem to remember seeing numbers of around 150 to up to 180 beats per minute. But quite a lot of variation depending on whether it's the start of the race. Obviously, I think that would be the peak, would be the actual start. And I seem to remember with Nico, it might have gone up to like 180, 190 beats per minute and then settled down more like 150 for the majority of the race. I do remember Michael telling me that keeping his heart rate down was really important for him. He said it was mainly to keep his emotions down. And he had to work really hard, he said, to do that. It was something he was constantly on his mind, or not constantly on his mind, but it was in his mind to make sure that he didn't get his heart rate up. And he worked hard to keep it down. And he felt that was better for his performance.
Yeah, and I think he's absolutely right there, because you are giving yourself much more capacity to think and breathe and strategize and all the other things you want to do with your brain. And I suspect now a lot of the top drivers now, well, most of them on the grid probably are pretty low, but you'd get a Yuki Tsunoda or maybe a Liam who's probably a bit higher when they're throwing the car around. But Max always looks really calm and looks like his pulse rate. I remember Gilles Villeneuve was once, we had something on him, a monitor on Gilles from the Canadian Institute, actually. And it was at the French Grand Prix at Dijon, where he had a shunt. And I remember the pulse rate for Gilles when he had the shunt and he went through catch fencing and stuff. It was below 170. It was around the 160 mark, which is quite impressive, really, isn't it? It's just like, here's a shunt, no worries. Classic Gilles. Anyway.
Fearless, wasn't he?
yeah, he was. He was amazing. Who would you say was the most fearless driver you've ever worked with?
Goodness, that is a difficult one.
Well, let's park it and think about it as we go on.
Yeah. In many ways, I think some of them could sort of turn it on and off. Mika, when he could do a qualifying lap that was absolutely unbelievable. Mm-hmm. It was like he just switched into a different mode. And we used to say when the force was with him, because he was definitely a driver who needed to feel that everything was right for him, and when it was right, he could do things that were unbelievable. And he appeared not to appreciate limits at that point. But I would say all the others that I've worked with had a very good knowledge of where the limits actually were and what they were capable of. And it wasn't fearlessness; it was smartness, I would say. Mm. It wasn't fearlessness, because I think fearlessness, it can result in well, okay, I will say one, Pastor Maldonado. There was a certain amount of fearlessness involved in that. I don't know if you remember, there was one time when I think it was in 2015 in Austria, he was trying to pass Max on the straight. This was in the Renault. Mm-hmm. And he actually, when he pulled out from behind Max in the slipstream up to turn one, he actually lost the rear end of the car on the straight, but he just kept his foot in it. And I remember he actually got past Max at turn one, and I think Max was quoted after the race as saying that he saw what happened in the mirror and he thought, he wants it that much, he can have it. And that's that, and I think that's pretty phenomenal. Yeah, I'd say Pastor definitely fits into the fearless range, but the problem for Pastor was he was actually a better driver than most gave him credit for, but he didn't know his limits. That was the biggest problem. Yeah, he didn't know his. Yeah,
but he certainly did the job. He did the job in Barcelona, didn't he? Not only winning that Spanish Grand Prix, but beating Alonso in a Ferrari. Yeah. In front of Alonso's home crowd, and he still won the race. I'm sure Fernando was just sitting there waiting for the guy to go off, and
absolutely. Well, we all were. Yeah, because I was working with Kitty in the Lotus, and we finished third in that race. And he drove an absolutely fantastic race. Pastor did in that one, absolutely perfect. So he could do it, and obviously he won the. I guess it was it GP2 championship. Yeah. So he could do it, but for some reason, I think I don't know. I just got the impression that it didn't really matter enough to him, maybe, for him to concentrate properly. Maybe I'm unfair in saying that, but maybe. Yeah,
maybe. Question from, is another regular, Gandalf the Fool. They've all got great names, these guys. First of all, he says, hi, Peter and Mark. Hope you guys are doing great. Question from Mark. How different in terms of driving style and technique was Kimi compared to DC and Montoya? That's an interesting question for you. Also, any differences between McLaren Kimi and Lotus Kimi? Good question as well, actually.
So differences in driving style, very, very different. And that was a big problem, actually, because we ended up having to do different suspension geometry, particularly between Montoya and Kimi. So this was a time when cross-weight with steer was introduced. So basically, as the driver steers, you can change your suspension geometry, mainly the push-rod pickup, so the inside tyre loads up. It's basically pushed down onto the track, because obviously normally what happens is the car corners, the inside wheel is lifted off the ground because of weight transfer. But this actually works in the opposite way by sort of forcing the inside wheel down. And you get less understeer mid-corner because of that. And Kimi absolutely loved it. It was just the best thing ever for him, because he hated mid-corner understeer. He wanted the car to almost turn itself in. He was very, very gentle with his inputs, and he just wanted it right on the knife edge, so just perfect. And he loved it when we introduced this crossweight with steer, because he didn't have to turn so much, and the car would do the work for him. With Montoya, he was very aggressive with the steering. And so what he tended to do was he tended to upset the balance of the car when he used it. So we ended up, obviously Montoya came into the team the start of 2005, and we'd already been using this for a couple of years, and he just couldn't handle it. And we ended up having suspensions that had less and less and less, until he actually got to the point by the end of 2005 where his steering was working the opposite way, where it was actually unloading the inside tyre more than our sort of standard suspension had 2 years previously, because he wanted to be so aggressive with the steering on the entry. And obviously what that means is the two drivers are driving the car in such a different way that you're almost unable to use their feedback, because they're just driving different cars. I think DC was somewhere between those two, as most other drivers are, to be honest. So he could cope with an amount and make use of it, but maybe not quite as much as Kimi, and I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have been as happy with Montoya's setup either. So, yeah.
Just to interrupt there, Mark, what you've just described there between Kimi and Montoya, there's the definition of a short corner driver against a long corner driver, interestingly.
Yeah, okay. So Kimi, the short corner driver.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, they're both very effective methods. Obviously, Montoya was very fast, and Kimi was very fast. I think what it sometimes caught Kimi out a little bit was in a qualifying situation. If it was a little bit on the edge, he'd get it slightly too much on a corner, and we'd lose a tenth or two on the corner entry. So sometimes you saw that odd error. And one of the things that was particularly brilliant about Kimi in 2005 is he just didn't make those errors. In 2003, 2004, he used to make the odd error that you'd catch him out. But in 2005, he was just so good. It was just immaculate. It was unbelievable. And Montoya couldn't. He could beat him on occasion, but consistency over the season just wasn't there. He couldn't match it. But Montoya also knew that he had to do something different than Kimi to beat him. He knew that if they're in the same car, he wasn't gonna beat him. So
that's an interesting
part of it was Kimi. I think there was a slightly political element in it as well, in terms of trying to destabilise Kimi a little bit. It didn't really work, because Kimi's the last person you'll ever destabilise. Really.
Well, yeah.
I don't know if you
pulse rate maybe in triple figures. I'm not sure with Kimi.
Yeah, I think he probably used to get quite agitated sometimes. He's not always the cool guy that people think he is. His first race was in Melbourne in 2002. There was that big accident at the first corner, and Kimi had to drive through a load of gravel, and it actually went down his back. It got between the seat and his back on the first lap, and he came into the pits shouting on the radio, "You've got to get the stones out of my back, stones!" And the guys had to reach in and try and rake out the stones from behind his back. But my goodness, he was absolutely on the limit there. Yeah, he was very agitated about that. But he did just get back on with it. I can't remember whether he finished that race, unfortunately. I think he scored some points, but anyway.
I can't remember either.
Kimi was...
Yeah, but okay, let's compare McLaren Kimi with Lotus Kimi.
Yeah, he'd got older. And he got a little bit less flexible, maybe, with things. He was a little bit grumpier, might I say. Certainly, I think some of that was to do with what went on in the team. Certainly in 2013, when he wasn't getting paid properly, unsurprisingly, he was feeling that the team wasn't supporting him in the way. Because, we actually had a realistic shot at the championship. Certainly in 2013, the car was fantastic, and at the start of the year he was on fire. But other than that, in terms of his driving, no, he was the same Kimi, driving the car very precisely, knew what he wanted. His feedback was exceptionally good. When we made changes to the car, he just knew straight away whether he was happy or not happy, and he tended to give very good feedback on what needed to be adapted to the car. So I thoroughly enjoyed working with Kimi in both phases in that respect. He was the same Kimi, and absolutely fantastic. Yeah.
Good, thank you for that one. Another question for Mark. Compared to the early 2000s, how different is it to set up a Formula One car nowadays? Is it easier or more difficult in general?
Is it more? It's just different because you've got a lot more information these days. Obviously, the cars are different now with the ground effect cars that they're still being run at the moment, although not from next year. And they have different requirements in terms of the ride height is more important. Ride height's always been important, but it's become more critical with the ground effect cars. So you're making slightly different compromises, but the overall challenge is still entry stability, mid-corner understeer, getting the power down. That's the same problem. And then trying to run the car as stiff as you can get away with to keep the ride heights down. And the roll stiffness, probably, it depends on the car. Some cars are aerodynamically susceptible to roll, and some cars are less susceptible. So with the cars that were susceptible aerodynamically to roll, you had to run them more stiff, which, you'd run the car as stiff as you could get away with. The 2007 McLaren, we ran incredibly soft because the aero seemed to be little affected by it, and the car was just better when we ran it softer. So it depends on the car. But the fundamental challenge is exactly the same as it always has been. Keeping the driver happy, making him confident with the car, confident to push. So no, I don't think it's changed that much. It's just that you've got more people giving you more information. So you know a bit more about the tyres, you know more about the aero and what the aero characteristics are of the cars. So you're working more towards keeping them within those parameters, which, frankly, in the past, we just didn't know where those envelopes actually were. So there was less knowledge, shall we say. And so, so you relied more on the instincts and the driver feedback. Whereas now that driver feedback is a little bit tailored to suit what you also know about the rest of the car.
Mark, is that roll stiffness sensitivity about which you were just speaking something that you can accurately get from the aero program, from the wind tunnel, from all the computer work that goes into that? Or is it usually something you only discover when you start running the car?
It obviously depends on the quality of the wind tunnel data. Normally you'd have some idea of it, but you wouldn't be entirely sure how strong it was until you did some track testing. And then from the track testing, running the car on the track and race data, you learn more. You generate a bigger envelope of knowledge, and you'd use that to adjust how you ran the car. Certainly, I think it was the Renault in 2018-19 was very roll sensitive. We used to have to run it basically as stiff as we could, and then that brought other problems with it. Yeah, I mean, the ground effect cars now, they are inherently less roll sensitive than those flat bottom cars were at that time, because it was all to do with the floor, the aero around the tyre, the rear tyre, where the tyre interfaced with the floor. That was a particularly sensitive area. So you have to be very careful on that. And maybe with the new generation of cars coming in next year, maybe it'll become more of an issue again. I don't know. But yeah.
Good. Another good question here, I think. What would engineers do when they can't set up a car to find a balance between what the car can offer and what a driver can do? In other words, if you get to an impasse, I guess the question is, do you go in the direction of the driver or do you go in the direction of the car in terms of the next best thing?
You try to find the best compromise, and it's part of the job to make the driver aware of the limitations of the car and what the downsides are. Is if we adjust the car to what he wants more than the car should be, can you say, if you see what I mean? So it's all part of that. That is an important part of the job, is the communication with the driver, trying to convince them that this is the operating window that it needs to work within, and suggesting to them what driving changes they might have to make to get the most out of the car. It's not it's not just a question of setting the car up. The driver has to adapt, and the best drivers are the ones that adapt the most, I would say, because the cars do have operating windows that they work well within, and if you go outside those, you lose performance. Now, obviously, there's a question of if the driver can't drive the car in that window, it's actually slower for him to do that than moving outside those windows to make him quicker. Effectively, he will be quicker in some circumstances. Then you do a little bit of that. The one we had was with Nico in Abu Dhabi. I think it was 2019. At that time, we had a device on the car, the rear suspension, which the car lowered on the straights under aero load, basically to reduce drag. But through the high-speed corners, turn 2 and 3 in Abu Dhabi, it was activating, which meant the rear ride height was dropping. And he had too much understeer. He fell through those corners. And certainly if the rear ride height dropped, it picked up more rear downforce, it would cause a bit more understeer. So he was absolutely adamant that we needed to stop that effect from happening. It was something that we could switch on and off. And we strongly advised him that we didn't think it was the right thing to do. He would lose too much straight line speed and he wouldn't recover that speed in those corners. But he couldn't be convinced. I remember having a discussion with him and Karen Pilbeam, who was the chief engineer. We both had to sit down with Nico and try to explain to him, what we wanted to do, and he just wouldn't have it. And we ended up taking locking the suspension, running the car without that effect. And sure enough, he didn't have much less understeer in the high-speed corners, but he did go slower down the straights, and it hurt our performance. So we failed in that we couldn't convince him. That's very, very rare, very rare. Normally, you come to an agreement and the drivers are fully on board, and you're on. You do the best you can.
There seem to be a lot of questions, Mark, about breakdowns like that in communication or between the pit wall and the driver. Listen to this next three. They're all related questions. Hi, Peter and Mark. Thanks for joining us. Mark, what is your approach when the pit wall and driver have a difference of opinion in strategy during a race? Semi-relatedly, when a driver says that they don't want any more radio messages, which we hear periodically, to what extent is that actually followed? And at that point, has the driver-engineer connection completely broken down for the day, and how detrimental can this be to the running of the race? Nico Harkenberg, please advise, I guess.
Yeah, it very much depends on the circumstances.
And the driver, I guess.
The circumstances of the driver. I mean, Kimi famously didn't like people talking to him very much. Mika was the same. He didn't want me to talk to him very much. So it can disturb their concentration, can't it? So if you've got someone squawking in their ear all the time, so you've got to be aware of that. You've got to be sensible. There's no point saying things that aren't helpful, are there? And frankly, I do hear quite a lot of comments on the radios now that I'm watching, and I just think, well, why on earth did they say that? That was completely unhelpful. It just was distracting, or even. So I think that the engineers do need to be very careful. On the other hand, obviously, there is information that is absolutely essential to the driver, and you have to pass that information on. When it comes to the strategy, I think that's a really difficult one, because the tyres and their performance is one of the most difficult aspects. But if that's in disagreement with what the driver thinks he can achieve, you've got to go one way or the other. And I can remember situations where we went with the data and we were wrong. It turned out that the tyres could have gone much further than we thought they could. And there have been other situations where the driver's just destroyed the tyres because he hasn't done what we've asked him to, and we've had to change the strategy based on that. So it's a difficult one. It really is a difficult one. The drivers don't have all the information available to them in terms of weather, for instance, or other things that are happening on the track necessarily that you might be trying to react to. So you have to try and help them out with that by giving them more information. But it's very difficult to do that in a racing situation, and with some drivers more difficult than others, has to be said. But at the same time, we're not driving the car on the pit wall. The driver's got a much better feel for the tyres. And the better the driver, I would say, the better his feel, the more help he can give you and the more feedback he can give you and tell you what really the team should be doing. So it's a two-way story. And the teams that work best are the ones where that works as a team. where the driver's on board with the engineers are on board with the driver, and it just flows. And my time with Kimi, I would say, in McLaren when we were running the Michelins, was a good example of that. In wet races, he was phenomenally good at understanding what tyres he needed to be on at different times. And I used to go into wet races with Kimi believing that we would have a great result because he was so good at pointing out, when was the switch over from dry to wet, wet to dry. He would thoroughly nail it every time. Whereas other drivers, who I won't necessarily name, didn't know. And they would say, "Oh, you tell me." And well, we're not driving the car. We don't know what the conditions are. We can see something, but you're the one who needs to tell us whether you should be on wet tyres now or whether you can manage to stay on the dry tyres until this light bit of rain has passed. So, it's very much a mark of the good driver versus the bad driver, or the less good driver, as to how he handled those sorts of situations, I would say.
Mark, you've kind of answered one of the questions and one of the points I often make in when I'm looking at a Grand Prix and doing a video afterwards, which is why aren't all those different potential ways in which you can run a race discussed before the race in a proper briefing with both drivers? And you use the example of the tyres might be lasting longer than the tyre engineers in the team believe they would based on practice and qualifying. But why before the race isn't somebody, a chief engineer or maybe even the team principal, saying, okay, that's the tyre data we've got, but what are we going to do if after 5 laps before that the tyres are great? Let's go with a new plan now, what we're going to do if the tyres feel good. And the reason I say that is because mainly with Lewis, I got to say, Lewis at Ferrari, we often get Lewis saying, well, why have you done that? Why did you bring me in? And I always think to myself, why didn't they discuss? Why haven't they got plan down to Z, if you like, for all these different options? Don't you have those meetings with all the drivers and everybody in place and all the potential variables that can come into play?
Well, the simple answer is you do. We did have those meetings. We had a lot of meetings. Sometimes we thought we had too many meetings, and we had you have small, low-level discussions between 1 or 2 people. You have then a next step up where you'd involve the drivers and maybe 4, 5 people involved, and then ultimately you'd open it out to a bigger audience and pretty much tell everyone else what the plan was and what the options on that plan were. And you would have a variety. You have a option A, B, C, even D. You would have that. There are still certain situations where there might be something that's happened that you hadn't expected. But generally speaking, I would say in my experience, you pretty well have the possibilities discussed. What you obviously do have to do is pick the one you think is the most likely to decide on your initial strategy. Yeah. And that, I think that can be where it breaks down sometimes, is that if there is a tendency to fixate on that chosen strategy, and even the things that you've discussed sometimes get forgotten.
No, that's an important point, isn't it? Forgotten by the drivers or by the other team members?
Both.
Really?
Both. You get someone on the pit wall who just sort of gets involved, over emotional, and start shouting about stuff. Or just because you do have to. Ultimately, you have to have someone who makes the call. You can't have 5 people.
No.
All go. A bit like mission control. You can't have that because the timescales aren't. There's not enough time to make a choice. You have to have someone who finally says, "We're doing this now."
Right.
And when that person forgets some of what had been discussed earlier in the day or the previous 3 days, that can be a problem. But you have to have someone who makes a decision. And so it comes down to the better teams are the ones who, with that person, making the better calls. It's a quality of decision making, isn't it, at the end of the day?
It's a quality of decision making, and it's a quality of management as well, and making sure everybody has a clear brain and everybody understands what's going to happen before the race starts.
And what I would say is the way with Lewis at Ferrari now, it appears that he's not integrated well into that team. I would say that's the the feeling I get just hearing the calls, he doesn't feel, I don't think he feels comfortable in that team. He's not being talked to in the way that he would like. But bear in mind, he did have some moments with Mercedes as well, didn't he? You know, he did get on the radio and complain about things but I suspect that Mercedes somehow, discussions afterwards, somehow drew a conclusion, and he felt settled in the team. He felt the team were on his side. Whereas at Ferrari, I just get the impression that that hasn't happened yet. Yeah. He doesn't feel fully integrated. Maybe. I mean, another example I would give is Daniel Ricciardo, who I worked obviously on the other side, but he was in the team in Renault in 19 and 20, and he was phenomenally good. I cannot express how good Daniel was. He did things with that car that obviously it was capable of doing them, but to get the car to the level of performance that he was able to was a phenomenally good thing. He was so impressive. And then he went to McLaren, and it just didn't happen for him, did it, at McLaren? And I found that really shocking, because the performance capability that I saw from him, I was absolutely convinced this guy will be a world champion. He is so good. But some of the things I heard on the radio even there were, at Renault, he had things, words he wanted to be used. So when he talked about front wing adjustment, he talked about clicks of front wing. And I always had to ask his engineers, "Oh, what's that?" You know, in terms of, you know, because we talked about it in different ways. So there were certain words he wanted used, and I noticed on the radio at McLaren that they didn't use those words to him, and I just thought that was odd. I just thought, oh, are they making him fit McLaren rather than them adapting to him? And did that mean that, again, the relationship between him and the team wasn't as tight as maybe it should have been? It's just little things like that just make you wonder. And the tightness of the relationship is absolutely crucial. You know, I'd like to think I felt that with Kimi in particular. You know, I kind of knew what he was looking for, and I think he kind of knew to trust me, and so it worked very well. And then there are other times with other drivers where maybe it didn't work quite so well. Sometimes because the drivers don't really know what they want, so it's obviously difficult to have a tight relationship there. But there's definitely, you can see it with Max and his engineer. You know, they even though they sometimes have frank words with each other, you know that trust level is 100%, isn't it?
Yeah.
And if they have a disagreement, they're going to get over it, and they still fully trust each other. And it's really good to hear that. It's a really good working relationship that they've got. But I don't, and it's very difficult. It's based on humans, isn't it? You just interact with some people well and some other people not so well, and it's nobody's fault. It's just the way it is. But I think for the drivers, they really need to feel that interaction to get the absolute best out of themselves, for the teams to get the best out of them. So I do feel a bit for Lewis. I mean, obviously I worked not very much with him, but he was at McLaren when I was there in 7 and 8. And the guy is absolutely phenomenal. You know,
just on that point, to be honest with you, Mark, there's a question coming up from Andy B exactly on that point. He says, having been involved in over 500 Grand Prix, incredible achievements, sir. What made Lewis stand out as the best driver you've witnessed? I don't know if you've said that actually, have you? But maybe you can talk about that first test you did with him as well.
Well, funnily enough, that first test didn't actually go that well. He seemed to struggle a little bit in the car at Silverstone that day, and he seemed a little bit, he didn't really know what he wanted at that point. And I have to say that I was asked to sort of report after that test, because they were actually considering putting him in the car in 2006 at the end of the year, because Montoya had been given the heave-ho, and we had Pedro in the car, and Pedro, lovely guy, but not quite the pace of Kimi, who was still there. And there was some talk about putting Lewis in the car. And I have to say, after that test, I went back and said that I didn't think he was quite ready for it, because he hadn't gone that well in the test. He'd gone quite well, but he seemed to struggle a little bit. Funnily enough, in 2007 and 8, what we found was that at that time, Lewis wasn't that great around Silverstone. I don't know if you remember, but Heikki actually out-qualified him in 2008. So I think actually it was just that circuit at that time wasn't his best circuit, which was a little bit unfortunate.
But I remember him being very good in the GP2 race though in 2006, bizarrely.
Yeah, quite possibly. But it just seemed that he didn't quite gel at Silverstone in the F1 car at that point. But despite all that, once he was driving in the team, his natural ability was absolutely out of this world. I mean, he was so incredibly fast. He was very smart. He would look at Fernando's Friday data, look at where he was slower than Fernando, and on Saturday he was as quick as Fernando in those areas, and there were areas on the Friday he was already quicker than Fernando, and he would still be quicker than Fernando in those areas. So in qualifying, honestly, he had the upper hand most of the time, and this was his first year driving the car. It was absolutely stupendous how quick he was. Overall, I think they were almost infinitely closely matched, which was reflected in the point score at the end of the year. I mean, Fernando made a couple of mistakes which cost him the championship, as did the team for Lewis, as did Lewis himself. But they were incredibly well matched. But it was Lewis's just sheer speed, and the other thing with him was he could do long runs that were phenomenally consistent. And what I noticed, particularly running Heikki, was that you do a long run with Heikki, and Heikki and a long run with Lewis would do the same thing. And you'd look at the two cars after the long runs. Heikki's tyres would actually still be in pretty good nick, but he would finish the run a second a lap slower than Lewis. You'd think, oh, well, Lewis's tyres must be in better shape than Heikki's then. And you'd look at Lewis's tyres and they'd be absolutely destroyed. And he was still going a second lap quicker. It was just unbelievable.
He was putting so much more energy through the tyres.
He just adapted his driving constantly to get the maximum performance out of the car, whereas Heikki could drive good tyres quickly, but as the tyres dropped off, he couldn't adapt to maintain his pace. So give both drivers new tyres, they could do the same lap time, but give the drivers older tyres, Lewis could do a better job. He was just phenomenal. And I don't see why that would have changed. Okay, he's got a bit older. He will have got better in some areas. His tyre management will have improved. His ability to set the car up will have improved over time. He may have become maybe a little bit less flexible because he's got older and he's got used to a way of driving a Mercedes that now he's got to drive a car that behaves slightly differently, slightly different engine characteristics maybe. So there may be some of that, but fundamentally, he's not any slower. I don't believe he's slower. I think he's just not happy with his environment, and they've got to work on that, haven't they? Because he is one of the best drivers ever, if not the best. They just need to make the most of it. And if they're not doing everything possible to make him happy in the team, then they're making a big mistake, in my opinion. But it's difficult. It's always difficult.
Well said, Mark. Mark, just a detail. Brazil 07. What happened to Lewis in that race?
We never knew.
Really?
Yeah. So, to be honest, he got stitched up at the first corner, or the first four corners, by Fernando and Kimi. I believe that there were some discussions about how the first lap might pan out and where the cars might be on the track. And Fernando, there was something up. And when Lewis was dummied into running too long at turn 4, I think it is, on the first lap, I think there was a certain inevitability to that. But the gearbox problem that occurred later in the race, honestly, as far as I know, we never understood what happened. It was so bizarre. It was like, and there's no conspiracy theories, honestly, but it was like something had just momentarily just confused the gearbox electronics. The thing wouldn't shift gear. It didn't do what he wanted to do. and then that stopped, and he was able to carry on. And they took that gearbox apart after the race. They ran so many tests on everything to do with it, the control system, all the control parts. Never found a problem. It was just the strangest thing. It just wasn't meant to be, was it?
Maybe it was a cyber attack through GPS or something. Was it being correctly policed at that point?
I don't think that would have been possible at that time, would it?
Well, I don't know.
I mean, I don't know. Honestly, just completely unexplainable, and that's so unsatisfactory. Yeah. Because, but it just wasn't meant to be. Is all I can say. I don't know why, and it was really bad. We had the best McLaren post race party we ever had after that one.
Mark, sorry.
I was going to say, obviously, Fernando, I think by that point, probably almost couldn't win the championship. I was gutted that Lewis didn't win the championship. Obviously, you want your team to win the championship. At the same time, having worked with Kimi for so long, I was so happy that he did win the championship. And I bumped into him that evening in the bar at the hotel, and we had a bit of a hug. And, I just said, I'm sorry we weren't able to do that for you, but I was glad that he did win a championship because he should have won more than once. Yeah. But,
Totally agree with that. Mark, just on things that are unexplainable, or maybe they are, but is it my imagination or not? Are more drivers making errors pulling up onto the grid after the formation lap now and missing their grid point, or actually messing up the start than ever before in recent times? And if so, why? Surely that's the easiest thing in the world to get on top of, isn't it? Make sure you stop on your mark and do the start well.
The visibility is really bad out of the cars. They had to extend. There's a yellow line that's painted out of the grid spot, isn't there, off one side, and they had to thicken those and extend them a few years ago because the drivers literally couldn't see them. So that might be a factor. The drives are well buried into the cars these days. They can't really see very much out of them. So if you look at Fernando in his car, you've always wondered how the hell he manages to see anything at all. So that's a bit of a factor. But I think they're just, it's so tense. There's so much for them to think about. There's so many demands on them. I think some of them are just making the odd mistake. I think we had one with Nico where he just wasn't applying enough brake pressure. He selected first gear and it gave the car a nasty jolt, and that was enough to trigger. I think that was enough to trigger the false start. And I suspect that may have been what happened with, was it Oscar?
Yeah.
So I think that's just and obviously you want to apply as little brake pressure as you can so that when you release, that interaction between brake and acceleration is minimised. So I think it's just, there's so much pressure on them. I think it just can happen. Pulling up in the wrong grid position completely, I don't understand that. I think that's just a...
Well, I mean, if the visibility's poor, you line up something on the pit wall or something, don't you? Or
they show boards down one side. Yeah, they show boards down one side, and normally they just follow each other around in single file, don't they? And the guy head pulls up into his, and then if his is on the left and yours is on the right, you swing across to the right, and then the next guy pulls up on the left, etc. So I think just lapses in concentration are what happened there.
But going back to the starting technique, unlike, say, driving with understeer, which is quite a difficult thing to practice as a racing driver, because, you're either doing it in a race environment or maybe a few laps on full tanks or whatever, maybe simulator. But you can practice quite a lot of starts, can't you, or not, in the course of a race weekend? I'm surprised that things like the right amount of brake pedal pressure are not very quickly established by the end of Friday practice. Or is it because the friction on where they are on the grid is always going to be very different from anything they've done up until that point?
Exactly that. Exactly that. I mean, most of the practice starts are done at the end of the pit lane. You can do some potentially from the pit stop area at some circuits. Some circuits you can't do them at the end of the pit lane, which reduces the opportunities. But also the car's behaviour depends on how hot the clutch is. So it depends on the start they did leaving for the start of the formation lap, how the clutch has behaved around the formation lap, the number of burnouts they do approaching their grip position, how quickly or how much gap there are between those burnouts. So you'd advise the driver to do X number of burnouts. You'd advise him how you want the burnouts done. If they don't do it quite right, or the track grip will be different because there have been different events occurring, if it's rained, etc. So there's lots of variables. So no matter how much you practice, there's still enough variables in there to cause problems. It's all about...
Are those, the number of burnouts, is that purely related to rear tyre temperature, or is it also clutch?
No, but tyre temperature.
Right.
Yeah, you're looking for a target tyre temperature.
Right. Okay.
I mean, ideally, you'd keep the clutch as cool as possible. So what you certainly don't want them doing is slipping the clutch a lot. Sometimes you see the cars on the grid, some of them would do like bite point finds before they'd select a gear. And that's trying to set the clutch to a particular temperature, so a repeatable temperature. Because it might be that a cooler clutch gives you better bite, but if you can't practice that, you want at least it to be a temperature that you've used before for practice starts. So that'd be why they would do that. I'm not sure that many teams do that anymore, if any, in fact, but it was certainly something that some teams used to do.
No.
It's not easy. I'm impressed how consistent the drivers are at it. Actually, it's one of the things that is super impressive about these guys. They are, and Kevin, going back to Kevin Magnussen, who I worked with, he was a phenomenally good starter. I don't know how he did it, honestly, but his clutch and throttle timing and manipulation was superb, and he would regularly make 1, 2, 3 places at starts. It was something you could always expect him to do. Very, very impressive.
You obviously got a soft spot, I would think, for Kev, is that right? And how good is he? And should he should have won some Grand Prix, right? I guess, in your opinion, yeah.
I think Kev's a lovely bloke, fantastic driver. I think Kev didn't get to drive good enough cars, was part of his problem. The other thing, he is a bit inflexible in his driving style. He has a way of driving the car, which is braking as late as possible and then turning in quite aggressively. And it doesn't suit the current generation of cars and tyres. The Pirelli front tyres are quite weak in their lateral grip capability. So the cars have understeer. They have a lot of understeer, particularly at lower speeds. And that's the big problem that all the teams are trying to deal with all the time. And it just didn't suit him because he wanted to brake late and hard and stay on the brakes into the corner. And he's loading the front up very heavily. And the front tyres just gave up and the car would just plough on in the corner. And he found it very difficult to restrain himself from doing that. Which I think is a shame, I think, but it's part of the game, isn't it? You know, the drivers who adapt are the best drivers at the end of the day. There were days when it worked fantastically well. I remember in Mexico last year, in the race, he was catching Max towards the end of the race. We were just watching the screen and going, wow, this is amazing. He was just absolutely on it. And it just happened that the car and tyres at that moment in time were completely in sync with his driving, and he was just flying. But it just didn't happen often enough, and he tended to make a few too many mistakes in qualifying situations. Latterly, he found it quite difficult to maximise qualifying, which was a shame. And he used to get disturbed by cars ahead of him on the track in qualifying and stuff. I think... it just didn't quite work as well as it could have done. But I think if we'd got Kev into a faster car earlier in his career with a team that he was comfortable working with, I think he would have done a lot better. He certainly had a lot of natural capability.
In other words, if he'd stayed at McLaren.
Well, yes, I think it is. Well, I don't know, because McLaren went into that downward spiral, didn't they, at that point? So he would have been in a McLaren that was going badly back then. There was a really bad set of circumstances at McLaren in the 14, 15, 16 period, which the current Zach Brown, I think, going in there as he's transformed that team through his choice of people and the way he operates that team. That it's very impressive to see.
It is. Mark, you've worked with Oliver Burman too. I mean, he's going very well this year, and potentially might be seen in a Ferrari, I guess, at some point. How good is Oliver, do you think?
Yeah, I think he's very, very good. What was so pleasing about him was that he's brought such a fresh face to it, as in he was open to things, and he was just naturally quick. He just got in the car and he was doing stuff, and we were like, wow, that's impressive. He was just straight away on it, and he would listen and learn from what you advised as well. But it was just his natural, and I would say, adaptability. I think he showed it straight away that he was a very adaptable driver, and he just got in the car. He very quickly got to grips with what its weaknesses and what its strengths were, and he started driving around them. So I was very impressed. And I remember discussing with Io at the end, towards the end of the year last year, or even it was actually about midway through the year. He was saying, do you think Ollie's capable of driving this car next year? And you were like, I think he is, absolutely. He's a hot prospect. If anything, I've been slightly disappointed with him this year, I'd have to say, in that I thought he's made more mistakes than I thought he would do, which is it's cost him, hasn't it? Some of the penalties he's had in qualifying, like the Silverstone one, was really stupid, and he shouldn't have done that. So he does need to get on top of that sort of thing, because that really hurts you. His race pace, I think, has come on. If anything, last year in Baku, his race pace wasn't as impressive as his qualifying pace, and Nico certainly had a handle on him there. But I think this year he's improved in that area. What he has been slightly unfortunate with is that when he's been the quicker car, I think they've run experimental strategies with Ocon, and sometimes those have paid off, and it's ended up with Ocon finishing ahead of Ollie. And that's an unfortunate consequence of qualifying better sometimes. Is you sometimes end up with the boring conventional strategy, which turns out not to be the one that works. So but I think Ollie's he's got a good future ahead of him.
Good. This question's just for me, and it's a very quick answer about the spreadsheet comparing drivers past and present. I know exactly what you mean. It's Corey's, and I will bring that into a future live stream again to go through that. So thanks for that question. Another question from Mark. Significant increase in races per season over your career. Has that made it tougher as a Formula One race engineer?
Yes, I would say. Maybe it's because I've also got older. Because we used to do racing and testing. So a typical scenario back in 2000, 99, 2000 would have been 17 races, 18 races. You'd get home from a race late Sunday night, early Monday morning. You'd go into the factory on Monday. You'd instantly be preparing for a test that started on Wednesday. You'd fly out to that test on the Tuesday. So you'd have one day at the factory, and then you'd be heading straight back out. And that test would finish on Friday, and you'd fly home and get home again late Friday night. And the following Wednesday or Thursday, you'd be going to the next race. So that was a bit crazy. But you learned a lot about the cars doing that, unsurprisingly. Nowadays, you're not doing the testing, so you're kind of learning less about the car. You're relying more on what other people are telling you. You're relying more on simulations. And I felt that it was a bit less instinctive in the way I could operate. And it's 24 races this year, and remember, they're weekends. They're 24 weekends, whereas tests weren't at weekends. So you're doing 17 races. So you lost 7 weekends out of your life, which are important recuperation times. And the stresses of racing are different than the testing is less stressful. It's different stresses, but it's less stressful. So more races is more stressful. So I found that it just it just became a bit more mechanical in the way you were operating. I felt a bit more stressed out, a bit more tired, and I just overall I started to enjoy it less, I'd have to say, by the end of it, which was a shame. I always enjoyed the track sessions, so sending the car out to the track was always a fantastic thing. It was always very exciting, it being right at the forefront, brilliant. But the rest of it just became a bit more of a drag, more long distance flying, because more of the new races are further away. Time zone changes, a big problem. It just mentally, physically, just becomes more demanding. And I guess as I was getting older, that was having more and more of an impact. So it was time to stop.
Well, you still look 21, Mark. You've done very well on it, that's for sure.
Right.
John,
you too, Peter.
John Sinclair on that note says, this is a fascinating chat inside the minutiae of the engineering side of things on race day. Super fascinating. Love your work, Peter and Mark. Thanks for this deep dive. Well, that's nice, isn't it, to hear that and say that? And it's unusual to have somebody as articulate as you and prepared to talk about some of these things that we all love in Formula One, So, again, a big thanks. I think I'm saying that on behalf of everybody. Retro Ghana, another one. Awesome, gentlemen. Let's see who takes it this weekend at Singapore. Hopefully it'll be a dry race. Yeah, we've had the wet in Singapore, haven't we? Tell us about the rain in Singapore.
Yeah, I mean, what did we have? We had wet starts to the 18, was it? He was going really well. I think he was running fourth, and we lost oil pressure, which was pretty tragic. I've always been amazed how few wet races we've had in Singapore, because it almost rains every day there. But the timing of the race almost seemed to be such that it never affected the race. But I love a wet race. I think they're great. It's that it disturbs things, doesn't it? Because in Formula One, the teams and drivers, they tune in to a particular set of circumstances. They're honing it in is what it's all about. And so when you get to the race on a dry track with no surprises, you pretty much know what's going to happen. There's very little jeopardy, and rain just adds jeopardy to it, and it just makes it so much more interesting. But it's not false jeopardy. I think that's important. It's not a creation that's been deliberately. It's not manipulation. It's real. You have to deal with it. So I really enjoy that.
But we did get quite a lot of negative feedback on this show, particularly after the British Grand Prix, with people saying, "Are we ever going to have a wet race again?" And it wasn't only there, of course. And it's this whole business of it's too wet to go out. And the extreme wets very rarely get used these days, and they're
terrible tyres.
They're what?
Yeah, they don't work very well. Is the problem there? The teams know that an intermediate tyre or a dry tyre is always going to be the faster tyre. So, and you also know that if you stay on intermediates until there's a red flag, you don't have to put the extreme wet on, and so that's what they set out to achieve. Unfortunately, I don't see a way around that.
No, I get that side of it, but I guess what I'm really trying to say is a lot of people would love to see a full wet race with a wet start on the grid, standing start in the rain with lots of spray. Let's bring it on, But we very rarely have that now, if at all.
I agree, but the problem is the visibility, and I suspect with these bigger cars that we have now, they probably generate more spray, I imagine. And so that makes it a bigger problem. I mean, the problem with Spa in particular is obviously the top of Eau Rouge, because we've seen some horrendous accidents there, and very tragic. And I think it was completely understandable that they did not want allow that possibility to occur. I can. It's the nature of that track in particular. If a car loses it at the top of the hill in front of the pack, it's unimaginable what could happen there. So I understand that. I think they are, in my opinion, they are being a bit too cautious the rest of the time, and I think they should open it up and just say, no, this is part of it. got to get on with it and race. And then they would have to put full wet tyres on. I mean, look at what we did with House last year in Montreal. We put the full wets on for the race start because that is a low energy track with low downforce. It was cold and wet. We knew from experience that the intermediates are really hard to get going. And putting the full wets on that particular track, and there aren't many where that would work, but it was absolutely the right thing to do. And it was great. But we unfortunately made a mess of it at the first pit stop with Kevin, which was really frustrating. So they can be useful, but generally speaking, the teams aren't going to put them on. But I do, as I said, I agree that they're going to have to allow a bit more jeopardy to be involved. The drivers are super skillful. They need to show it. And we have to accept that motor racing is still dangerous, and an amount of risk should still be, in my opinion, part of it. But I think with the money that's involved in the sport now, the growing global audience, it's and I suppose maybe with the American influence and the risk of litigation, maybe those are factors that influence how these decisions are made these days. I think it's a bit of a shame. But I think Spa is unusual in that the layout of that circuit is fundamentally dangerous, and I can understand why they were unwilling to take a risk there. But I think other circuits, I'd like to see more wet races.
We also had the other element to the Spa thing, of course, was that some drivers, Max notably, Fernando, I think, had the car set up for the wet and others didn't. And again, we had quite a lot of feedback on why do they bring that little wrinkle into the variables? Why not, if it is going to be a wet race, why not allow everybody to go to a wet setting so you don't have to take that gamble? You run dry in qualifying and then everybody goes to a wet setting on race day. Why wouldn't they do that?
Well, because those are the rules.
Yeah, I know it's the rules, but why don't they change the rules?
Largely because of curfew, largely because of the difficulty managing the technical specs of the cars. We were heading to a point before Parc Fermé was introduced where we were literally going to have two cars, one for qualifying and one for the race. We were going to have cooling systems that were just complete lost cooling systems. So the cars weren't going to have radiators. You were going to have different calipers because you don't need a brake caliper as strong to do 6 laps as a caliper that's going to do 60 laps. And the cost implication of that was ridiculous. And so I think it was right to insist that the car be the same car, basically, between qualifying and the race. And that's where Parc Fermé came from. And then the follow-on from that is you can't make any other changes because where do you draw the line?
Okay, well, let me... I see where you're going with this, but then why, if they allow front flap adjustment, why wouldn't they just say, okay, to make it a little bit fairer, we'll allow rear wing adjustment only if it's set up for the... if you've got a wet setting and it turns out to be dry, whatever, you can adjust the rear wing. Why wouldn't they do that? What's the difference between adjusting the rear wing to the front wing?
Yeah, well, on the rear wings are almost not adjustable as they currently are. You could maybe add a gurney flap, but that'd be about it. So that would require redesign to make wings adjustable in terms of a higher downforce setting being available, because the effect of the gurney flap is almost negligible. In terms of going from dry to wet. The reason for not wanting to change parts is because of part weight more than anything else. So it's difficult to keep control of the car's weights and make sure the cars stay legal. It's incredibly complicated. Basically, the more freedom you allow, the more complicated it gets.
Yeah.
The FIA, there's only a certain number of guys there who can scrutineer and keep on top of the cars. Maybe there's 5 or 6 guys, and you talk about 10 teams with a huge number of people in those teams, and just keeping on top of all of that is really hard. So the route they choose is to minimise the opportunity. and I can understand that.
Yeah, now you've explained it. I think I do as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
At the end of the day, the difference between a dry setup and a wet setup on a Formula 1 car, it's not that big anyway. It's really just a question of downforce, maybe a little bit of roll stiffness or camber or something. So, you can change the car within the scope you've got, but I think that's all part of the fun, isn't it? If some cars go into a qualifying session in a wet setup and some cars go in a dry setup and someone's got it wrong, that's part of the fun. That's part of the jeopardy. And I think saying that you could change the cars would actually spoil it in some ways, because it would mean everyone was then the opportunity to correct their mistakes.
Yeah,
I would like to be
obviously the focus was on, but the focus was on
Yeah,
Max,
cool.
obviously in Spa,
Yeah.
and the point was he had the car set up for the wet, and he couldn't take advantage of that because they faffed around for so long that by the time they started the race, his race was over because he was going to be blown away on the straight.
And I think that is sad, because they kind of made a good choice. And so if they now know that races are never going to be allowed to run in properly wet conditions, then no one will ever take that risk. No one will gamble on that again. And that's a shame. So I think it'd be better to leave the rules as they are, but to be braver when it comes to allowing cars to race in the wet, personally. Yeah. So it is the track that is different, because it is those outside factors that you need to change. It's that's what catches teams out when the weather changes dramatically, like temperatures. When the temperature changes dramatically one day to another, it catches the teams out. When the track conditions, the track surface is different from one day to another, it does catch teams out. When the tyres that were right the day before are now wrong, it catches them out, and that's the jeopardy that you need to mix things up and to make it more interesting. So I'd like to see more of that, but what I don't want to see is reverse grids, because that's manipulation, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, totally agree with you.
I'm all for letting nature jeopardise things and other factors, but what I don't want to see is actual outright manipulation, personally. But there you go.
Mark, how are you doing for time? There's so many questions. I'm scrolling down now.
I could go on forever. Everyone will get sick of the sound of my voice. So.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll do a few more. And I just want to throw one more in there, because I've also been saying, and maybe incorrectly so, that if you put aside the rule which says that behind the safety car, lapped cars are allowed to unlap themselves before the race is restarted, Abu Dhabi aside, 21, and if you bring into account the number of incidences there are of drivers running too slowly, too quickly, whatever, with the safety car conditions, and also the money that comes into Formula One, presumably from Aston Martin and Mercedes, paying for all these cars, if you put all that to one side, is there any reason why from here on in we couldn't just run with a virtual safety car all the time? And if so, wouldn't that be better and fairer?
I think it is possible that you could run without with a virtual safety car. Why do you think that would make it fairer, though?
Because of all the dramas we've had with penalties for a start, and it's very. And I'm also saying virtual safety car should also be applied in a red flag situation of the type Oliver Behrman faced at Silverstone. I mean, if that had gone straight into virtual safety car, there's no way he would have done what he did going into the pit lane, because he's controlled by speed. And it's a grey area, really, isn't it? When you'll probably say it isn't, but it's a slightly grey area in terms of what you can do when you leave the track just before you come into the pits or whatever for a red. Why not make everything incredibly simple and just have virtual safety car? And I say fairer only because the gaps stay the same. I mean, if you want the race to be restarted and rebooted every 10 minutes, fine. But if you want the gap that you've just generated over the last 25 laps to be rewarded, keep the virtual safety car.
So what you're actually saying is that the FIA would control the speeds of the cars remotely?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I suspect that is probably quite a difficult thing to do. I imagine they probably are working towards that, because I think that would be the right solution and as you say, would avoid those sorts of problems. The Ollie incident, I mean, he was a bit of a silly boy, wasn't he, really?
He was a young kid, but I mean, if it was virtual safety car blanket, it wouldn't have happened, would it?
And I believe that Jack said on the radio that he was happy to let DC through because he was his mate, and we were helping Jack win the championship. So he said, "Oh, let's let DC through to win the race" to his team. The message was passed down to McLaren. Ron immediately twigged, okay, if we swap DC and Mika now, then Mika will lead the race. So he told, I think it would have been Pat Fry, who was DC's engineer, to tell DC to let Mika back through, which reluctantly he did. And so when Jacques slowed down to let the McLaren behind through, it was Mika, it wasn't DC. So then what happened was, we had Mika leading the race, Jacques second and DC third. DC was absolutely furious. And I don't know if it's apparent in the footage from the race, but DC pulled a crazy manoeuvre to overtake Jacques coming into the hairpin at the end of the last lap. And I think he nearly took Jacques out to grab second. And obviously if he had slid into Jacques and taken him out, that would have been a bit of an issue, wouldn't it?
It would. I mean, Jacques would still have been champion because Michael was disqualified, wasn't he? But nonetheless.
Okay. Well, ultimately, yes. But
that just showed how annoyed DC was, actually, to have lost that win. Yeah. But ultimately, he was only in a position to win the race because Ron had interfered and told DC told Mika to box too earlier in the race. So Mika should still have finished second behind Jack, is the way it probably should have panned out. But there you go. And then it was kind of
when you try and interfere in things.
Well, it was kind of repeated in Melbourne in '98, wasn't it? The same thing. It's different circumstances, I know, but DC again had to do that, didn't he? Had to let Mika pass.
Now I have much less of a problem with that, and not because I was the beneficiary as Mika's engineer. So what happened there was there'd been an agreement for whoever led into turn one would win the race, and Mika beat DC off the start from pole position and led through turn one. And then we knew we were so fast. I mean, I think we were around a second and a half a lap quicker than everyone else. So we had already decided once the two cars were running first and second, they were going to cruise round. And there wasn't going to be a race because it was too risky. Because in those days, reliability was still a big issue, much more than it is now. So Mika wasn't pushing. And we were still pulling away from the rest of the field at a second a lap. But they weren't racing. This was the thing. They were not racing. They were just driving round. And we were so I was monitoring temperatures. I was Mika's race engineer now. I'd been the assistant the year before. And the Mika's brakes were getting a little bit hot because Melbourne was a very tough circuit for brakes. So I just went on the radio to Mika and I said, cool the brakes. Cool the brakes, just they're a bit hot. And he thought I said pit. So the next thing we knew, we see Mika come down the pit lane. And it was like, what the hell? So straight away, I'm back on the radio, drive through,
Yeah, but how did you not know at that point that there was some other problem that had made him come into the pits? Did you not have a conversation?
Well, he hadn't said anything.
You hadn't said anything?
No, I'd simply said cool the brakes. And there'd been no more conversation. I hadn't told him to box as he approached the pit lane, which is what you would normally do. And he came in because he thought I told him to box, which I hadn't. And I don't know if you know, Mika's deaf in one ear because of the shunt he had in '95. So that's part of the problem. And in those days, the earpieces and the communication systems weren't that great. The sound quality was pretty poor in his defence. So he came in, we told him to drive through, and of course that put him behind DC. But it was a totally, if Mika had been allowed to race, he may well have been 20 seconds up the road, 30 seconds up the road when that same mistake had happened. So who knows what the position would have been. So the only reason DC was leading at that point was because of basically not racing. So when Ron told DC, no, it's a team mistake, let Mika through, I actually felt that on that occasion it was fairer than the Jerez thing. The Jerez thing was, in my opinion, a total stitch-up. whereas Melbourne was more, that's what you have to do to manage things. But that's debatable.
Yeah,
but
I'm
anyway,
not sure. Yeah,
that's what happened in Melbourne.
And it changed the way it worked, actually, didn't it? Because thereafter, Mika became Mika, that we know and love, and DC became a great racing driver who had some great races and great wins. But he was also always scarred, I think, by Jerez and Melbourne in terms of his own ego.
I think he was, and I think that's unfortunate, and that comes down to management, doesn't it? I mean, DC was a fantastically good racing driver, and I think a lot better than he himself thought, to be quite honest. DC has said to me in the past, I've met him a few times, chats, and he's always said, "Oh yeah, but Mika was better." And I was like, "Well, he wasn't much better. Maybe he was a bit, but there were some tracks where Mika couldn't beat DC. Imola, Montreal, DC, Monaco,
Magny-Cours, maybe
potentially.
Magny-Cours.
No, agree. Monza, DC had the measure of him, and that was no mean feat to have the measure of Mika on any racetrack. So DC was a very, very good race driver, and with a little bit more confidence, I think he could have been a champion as well. And the only other thing that you could tell that DC never had enough confidence in himself, because he used to come in at the end of a run in practice, and he'd start complaining about the mirrors vibrating and things, and he wouldn't talk about what was precisely making him go slower on the balance of the car, whereas Mika would just say, "I've got too much understeer at turn 6," or whatever. And that was one of the small differences between them. DC, and then the other problem, this has been a joke amongst race engineers in the past, the last thing you want is a racing driver who speaks the same language as you, as their first language, because they'll talk too much. What you want is someone who has limited vocabulary, and so they are naturally forced to stick to the things that are important, and there is a small element of truth to that.
I always remember Patrick Head when we were running, when Williams were running Jonathan Palmer, Jollion's father, obviously, who was very good. I mean, Formula 3, Formula 2, Jonathan was very quick, and he was a good driver all round, sports cars, everything. But when he got to Williams, he really wanted to impress Patrick, or that's the impression Patrick got. And because Jonathan's very articulate, he started dividing the corner up into ninths, and the first ninth of the corner it's doing this, the second ninth it's doing that, and it sort of went on and on and on. I'm obviously exaggerating slightly, but it's exactly the point you've just made. If Patrick was French, not that that would ever be the case either, but if he was, Jonathan may still have the Williams drive. Interesting.
No, it's overcomplication.
It is,
and it's a skill, isn't it? In reality, it is a skill to be precise and to know exactly what it is that needs fixing. And it's a skill that Mika had to some extent. When you pinned him down to a circuit map, he was very good at that. And Kimi was the best, in my opinion. He was the best feedback from any driver I've ever had, including Michael, including Fernando. Fernando was clever because Fernando wouldn't necessarily tell you everything, because he would keep some of it to himself. And so you do a test in a practice session of 2 different settings, and you'd say, "Okay, Fernando, which do you think is better?" And he'd go, "I don't know. Let's leave it like this, or let's go back to the other one." And he wouldn't say, "There's not really much difference, but let's go back to the other one." And that would be all you'd get, and you'd know, okay, so the other one is better. And he just didn't want anyone to know. So that's Fernando.
Mark, let's draw a line there. You've been so generous with your time. 2 points. One.
No, it's no problem.
One, would you come back again? Can we do some more of this? I think there's going to be a lot of demand for your input, even straight after Singapore, and what you thought of that race. I'd love to do that. Would you be up for that?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Absolutely.
Point one. Point two.
I love talking about racing.
Point 2, of all the drivers you worked for, which was the driver that gave you the most backhanders, rewards, free cars, money, gold, Krugerrand, whatever, when you got them onto the podium or won a world championship or won a Grand Prix for them? Which driver gave you the most stuff?
None of them. No, I got a signed picture from Mika.
The flying fin. The flying fin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it says.
Yeah.
I got I did get one thing. Christmas 2003. I was at home. Van pulled up outside. DHL van with a box. Guy handed it over. Just a box, sort of squarish box. Opened it up, and it was a Kimi crash helmet.
Oh.
No message, no nothing. I never heard from him. He never sent me never heard it. So I just sent him a message saying, "Thank you very much for the helmet," and he just said, "No problem," and that was it.
But was it a real helmet that had just won a Grand Prix, covered in oil and rubber?
Yes.
Oh, good.
No. It wasn't a helmet he'd actually raced, but it was one of the helmets that was in storage. It was one of the ones that we had. He had about each year they'd have about 8 helmets, and it was one of those 8. So I still got that.
Good.
Famously, Fernando, in the Nürburgring in 2007, on the Thursday, Fernando came up to me and he said, "Can you give me a list of all the people who work on my car?" And I thought, okay, yeah, I can do that. And then it's like, well, to what extent? Because obviously there's the guy in stores who hands the parts out to the mechanics that work on your car. There's the tyre guy. You can't really define who works on one car and who doesn't work on one car. So anyway, I came up with a list that I thought was okay, as best as I could do, included the fuel guy and the tyre guy. But I didn't know what it was for, so we had our pre-chat, and then at the end I said, "Oh, but here's the list." And he said, "Oh, thanks very much." And then a little while later, he came back in the motor and he said, "Oh, can you these guys on the list? Can you get them just to meet me in the back? I just want to have a chat with my guys before the weekend starts." I was like, "Yeah, sure, no problem." So I went to the garage, got the guys, and said, "Can we all just gather? Fernando wants to have a quick word with us." And he appeared at the back of the garage with a bunch of envelopes, and he just said, and then he said, "No, at Renault, I used to like to share in my winnings with my guys on my car, and it's not something I've done at McLaren so far, but it's something I just like to show my appreciation for you being on my car and doing such a great job." And he handed these envelopes out, and we opened them, and there was I think there was €1,000 in each envelope.
Nice.
And we were kind of gobsmacked. And this included Tyler. I mean, you know Tyler. He was one of the guys there.
Of course.
And it was like, oh, blimey, we were just like, well, that's a bit strange. That's never happened before. And I think we were just sort of nonplussed. We didn't really know what to say. So we just said, "Oh, that's really kind. Thanks very much." And he was very humble. He wasn't,
Nice.
He was just saying, "No, I really appreciate your help." So anyway, we went off and did our thing, and a little while later, Dave Ryan came into the motorhome with a face of thunder, and he's like, "What the hell just happened in the garage?" And I was like, "Well, Fernando just did it." And he said, "Yeah, I thought that's what's happened. That's basically, you've got to give us all the money. You've got to give the money to me. You've got to give the money to the team. It's completely outrageous. We can't have that in this team." I was like, "Oh, okay. Really sorry. Didn't know that. Okay." And he basically said, "Anyone who doesn't hand their money back is going to get sacked." And we were like, okay. And it was made known, and everyone gave their envelopes back. And I believe the envelopes were basically given back to Fernando, and he was told never to do it again.
And I'm sure that's the case with all the teams today. They have that policy for sure.
I'm sure, and I actually think that's fine. I agree with that, really. But it became, the story went out, I believe, or it got known in the media that something had happened, and basically it was Fernando tries to buy his allegiance with his mechanics, and maybe I'm naive. I didn't feel that was what it was. It was I think that was kind of a normal thing back in the day. I know people who work with other drivers, like there was a guy I knew who had a watch that Riccardo Patrese had given him, and various people had various things that people who worked with him had given them. So, and I gather it was true that he had at Renault, he had given his guys stuff. So,
well, and I can tell you now, Carlos Reutemann always did that with his race mechanics, and so did Nigel Mansell. So there you go.
Yeah.
You know, you wouldn't be allowed to do it today because of the whole visibility thing and the whole team thing, but both of them did that for sure.
Yeah. But I think it showed the mismatch, and this is something we alluded to earlier about drivers feeling tight within their teams. I think this showed the mismatch between Fernando and McLaren in that, you know, I really liked Fernando and I liked working with him. He was a nice guy to work with. Yeah, he did play the game a little bit, as we've mentioned, but he was a good guy. He wasn't a nasty person.
No.
And some of the stuff that went on was started by the Lewis camp. You know, Lewis and his dad, they were a bit Machiavellian in some of the things they did. So but it just showed that Fernando didn't fit at McLaren, and it just got worse and worse after that. You know, well, certainly after Monaco. And I just thought it was a real shame because he was a brilliant driver, and he was an absolute massive asset to the team. So yeah, it was just such a real shame it didn't work out.
And he still is today, and he may well win the World Championship next year in an Adrian Newey, you know, Andy Cowell, Aston Martin, Honda. You know, why wouldn't he?
I wouldn't put it past him. He is a phenomenon. What I will say about Fernando is he is, and your experience with Nigel probably matches it, but I'd say he's the most determined person I've ever met. He's got determination written through him, and an absolute desire, and a hunger to be successful. It just eats him up from the inside out, and it's what drives him. And unfortunately, it can put him in some bad situations, and sometimes he oversteps the mark because of that just desire that rages through him. And he is a rage. He's quite something. But I really enjoyed working with him. And the next year, when he left McLaren and went back to Renault, didn't he? And we were I think again in Jerez, or maybe it was somewhere. Anyway, it was early one morning before the first day of testing. It was still dark outside, and one of the guys came up into the motorhome for me. He said, "Oh, there's someone outside who wants to say hello." I went down, and it was Fernando. He just popped along, and he gave me a big hug. And he said, it's great to see you after the winter, you know. And he was just such an honestly, openly friendly, lovely bloke.
Yeah.
You know, it's a side of him that people don't see. But he's a good guy. Honestly, I think he's a good guy. So.
What a great note on which to end it all, Mark. Thank you so much, mate. Brilliant. What a great discussion. I mean, we could be at dinner, we could be in a pub somewhere, just going on and on and on, but we've got to stop, I think, and let you carry on with the rest of your life, your proper life. So big thanks for that, buddy. And thank you, everybody out there, for your questions and comments. Apologies if we haven't managed to get to you, but we're going to do some more of this. This is such good fun. And yeah, you know, we'll have a look after Singapore is what we can say. And again, Mark, thank you. Thank you, everybody out there. And thank you to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to TrackNinja, and to REC Watches for their support. And without that support, this channel wouldn't be happening. So big thanks to them. Take care. See you soon.